Angela Davis was a woman who defied expectations before she even entered a room. Tall, poised, and dressed in a sleek navy suit that complemented her calm confidence, she walked through the glass doors of Echelon First National Bank with the grace of someone who belonged there, even though the receptionist didn't think so. "Ma'am, the assistant briefing is in room B," the receptionist said without looking up. Angela smiled politely, not bothering to correct her. She was used to this kind of assumption. It didn't matter how many buildings she owned, how many families she had helped through her real estate ventures, or how many times she had spoken at national housing forums, people still looked at her and didn't see power. But they would. She stepped into the sleek, overly air-conditioned boardroom where men in expensive suits murmured among themselves, barely hiding their surprise when she took a seat at the front of the room. Warren Carlyle, the senior vice president, raised an eyebrow. "Ms. Davis," he said, slowly, "we weren't expecting you to lead this proposal." He looked around as if waiting for someone else to appear. "No assistant. No team." Angela responded with a measured nod. "I am the team. And I appreciate you making time. I'd like to walk you through a new model for community-first housing investments, designed to generate strong returns while actually serving the neighborhoods we've historically overlooked." Warren chuckled and leaned back in his chair. "Community first, you say? That sounds ambitious. But I'm curious, what's the collateral on idealism these days?" A few of the others chuckled. One even smirked. Angela didn't blink. She calmly opened her presentation folder and began outlining her plan. Clear numbers. Evidence from her last 10 projects. The success of her mixed-income complexes. The innovative partnerships with local governments and job training programs. But as she spoke, she noticed the glances being exchanged across the table, dismissive, bored, skeptical. One board member even checked his watch. Warren interrupted her halfway through. "It's a noble idea, Ms. Davis. But banks don't operate on nobility. We need hard metrics, predictable ROI, and minimal risk. What you're proposing sounds like charity with a fancy spreadsheet." Angela closed her folder slowly. She looked at each man at the table. "And what you're proposing is more of the same, funding developments that line pockets while displacing communities. I'm not here for your comfort. I'm here for change." There was a tense silence. Warren leaned forward, clearly annoyed. "If that's all, we'll take your proposal under consideration. But don't hold your breath." Angela stood, nodding slightly. "Thank you for your time." She turned to leave just as the boardroom door swung open. "Apologies for being late," said a deep, familiar voice. Harold Jameson, the chairman of the board, stepped in. He was older, with silver hair and a presence that filled the room. When his eyes landed on Angela, they lit up. "Angela. My girl. I see you've already gotten started," he said warmly, moving to hug her. Warren paled. "You know each other?" Angela smiled for the first time that morning. "Harold's my godfather. I used to sit in this building as a little girl while he handled mergers. He taught me how to read financial reports before I could drive." Harold turned to the room, his voice calm but firm. "Angela is not just a visionary in real estate, she's one of the few people I trust to understand the balance between profit and people. Her proposal isn't idealistic. It's the future of sustainable investment." He placed a hand on Angela's shoulder. "And for the record, she's just been approved to serve on our community advisory board. Effective immediately." Warren sank into his chair. Others looked between each other nervously. Angela turned back to face them. "I stayed quiet earlier because I wanted to see what you'd say, to see how you treat someone you thought held no power," she said. "Now I want to see what you'll do, now that you know who I am. And more importantly, what I stand for." The silence was deafening. One by one, heads nodded. Harold looked at Warren. "I think it's time this board rethinks its definition of risk. Angela walked out of the boardroom without a word, her heels echoing confidently down the marble hallway. Behind her, the room remained still, not just out of shock, but out of reflection. A change had just walked through that room, and they all knew it. And in the weeks that followed, as Angela's affordable housing project became the cornerstone of Echelon's new community investment initiative, one thing was clear: never underestimate a woman who knows her worth, speaks her truth, and walks into a room already owning it. Angela's journey hadn't been easy. She grew up watching her mother work 3 jobs to keep a roof over their heads. That childhood lit a fire in her, a hunger not just to succeed, but to rewrite the very system that once tried to keep her small. She started with one property, an abandoned duplex she bought at auction with a microloan and a vision. From there, she built not just homes, but legacies, spaces that nurtured dignity, that gave families more than a place to sleep. She created opportunity. She restored pride. And through every zoning battle, every skeptical lender, every gentrifier who tried to erase history with glass condos, Angela stood firm. So when she walked into Echelon that morning, she didn't just walk in as a businesswoman seeking approval. She walked in as a builder of futures, a force sharpened by struggle and driven by love, for her people, her purpose, and the communities she called home. And no one, not even a table full of suits with spreadsheets, could stop what she came to do. In the weeks that followed, news of Angela's boardroom confrontation spread far beyond the confines of Echelon First National. Community leaders, housing advocates, and entrepreneurs alike began referencing her bold proposal as a blueprint for real estate with integrity. Invitations flooded her inbox, from think tanks, investment coalitions, and even federal housing task forces. But Angela didn't get swept up in the spotlight. She doubled down on her mission. She expanded her mentorship program for young women of color interested in real estate. She worked with local officials to push legislation that protected long-term renters. And she returned to that same bank, this time, not to pitch a proposal, but to co-lead a workshop for the very board members who had once dismissed her. The boardroom felt different then. Not because of its decor or technology, but because of the shift in respect. They no longer saw her as a gamble, they saw her as a guide. And Angela, with grace and fire, reminded them that the greatest investment they could ever make was in people. Her story wasn't just about building homes, it was about restoring humanity, one brick, one policy, and one bold step at a time. Months passed, and the ripples Angela had created turned into waves. Echelon First National's pivot toward community-first investing triggered a cascade effect across the industry. Competing banks launched similar initiatives, some purely for optics, but others, genuinely inspired by Angela's results. Her developments continued to flourish, not just as safe, affordable homes, but as vibrant community hubs with daycares, co-working spaces, and clinics embedded into their architecture. She didn't just build structures, she built ecosystems. One chilly morning, Angela stood at the groundbreaking of her newest project, the Davis Commons, a 10-acre redevelopment of a long-abandoned industrial lot on the city's east side. Reporters gathered. Kids from the neighborhood held hand-painted signs that read, "Welcome home." And behind Angela stood a coalition of leaders, elected officials, activists, local pastors, and former skeptics who were now proud allies. She took the podium and looked out over the crowd. Her voice, warm and steady, carried over the winter wind. "When I was a little girl, my mother used to tell me, don't wait for someone to give you power. Walk in like you already have it." That advice scared me then. But now, I know, it wasn't about arrogance. It was about agency. About the courage to speak for those who've been ignored. About claiming your place, even when the room says you don't belong. There was quiet applause, growing louder with each passing second. Angela continued, "This project isn't just about real estate. It's about justice. It's about legacy. It's about proving that when we invest in people, not just profits, we all rise. Because prosperity means nothing if it's only for the few." As the ceremony concluded and golden shovels hit the soil, Angela stepped back, letting the community lead the moment. She knew her role wasn't just to build. It was to uplift. Back at her office later that evening, Angela sat at her desk, watching the sun cast long shadows across a blueprint-strewn table. A photo of her mother sat framed beside a stack of papers. She touched it gently, then turned to draft the next proposal, this time, for a national initiative linking affordable housing with climate resilience. Because Angela Davis was never just building homes. She was building a movement. Word of the Davis Commons spread like wildfire, not just across the city, but across the country. Major news outlets featured Angela in primetime specials. "The Woman Redefining Urban Development," one headline read. "The Banker's Boardroom Revolution," read another. But Angela remained grounded. For her, it was never about the press, it was about the people. Soon, universities began inviting her to speak: Harvard, Howard, Stanford. At each campus, students packed auditoriums to hear from the woman who'd walked into a room full of power and refused to shrink. She didn't come with ego. She came with blueprints, lived experience, and receipts. And more than that, she came with solutions. In one particularly moving keynote, Angela paused in the middle of her speech and looked directly at the young women in the crowd. "Your seat at the table isn't a favor," she said. "It's overdue. And when you get there, don't ask permission to lead. Just lead. Speak. Build. And never forget the community that carried you." She launched a national fellowship soon after, Blueprint Rising, dedicated to mentoring and funding young Black and brown developers who wanted to transform their communities from within. The fellowship offered more than scholarships, it offered networks, legal resources, design labs, and most importantly, belief. And when a housing crisis hit the Midwest, triggered by decades of disinvestment, Angela didn't wait for an invitation. She flew out, walked neighborhoods block by block, listened to displaced families, and met with local mayors and school boards. Within months, she brokered a coalition of public and private entities to convert abandoned malls and warehouses into mixed-use housing, schools, and cultural centers. Where others saw decay, Angela saw rebirth. But with rising influence came louder criticism. Some pundits accused her of being too radical, of risking capital for compassion. Others questioned her credibility, reducing her work to identity politics. Angela didn't flinch. In an interview on national television, she responded calmly, "If advocating for dignity, access, and generational wealth for the historically excluded is radical, then maybe the status quo was never meant to serve us. I'm not here to make investors comfortable. I'm here to make communities whole." And whole they became. Echelon First National, once hesitant and insulated, had fully transformed under Angela's influence. Their community portfolio had grown 300%, not in charity write-offs, but in profitable, socially impactful projects. Other banks followed suit, implementing Angela clauses in their lending practices, provisions ensuring equity-focused developments would no longer be sidelined in favor of short-term luxury builds. By year's end, the National Economic Council invited Angela to Washington, D.C., to consult on a new federal framework for housing equity. She stood in a room once occupied by lobbyists and lifetime bureaucrats, now welcomed as a visionary. She didn't just offer theories, she brought data, community voices, and a track record no one could ignore. And when the president asked what she envisioned for the country's future in housing, Angela replied, "A nation where a child's zip code doesn't determine their destiny. Where wealth isn't concentrated in skylines, but spread across neighborhoods. Where housing isn't a hustle, but a human right." That evening, as Angela returned home to her quiet neighborhood, a neighborhood she had once saved from redevelopment bulldozers, children ran up to greet her. Elders waved from porches. A mural of her had recently been painted on a brick wall near the community garden she helped fund. It showed her standing tall, blueprint in hand, surrounded by homes, trees, and smiling faces. She paused in front of it for a moment. Not to admire herself, but to remember what it all meant. Because for Angela Davis, the mission was never just about changing minds in boardrooms. It was about building futures where every person, no matter where they came from, could walk into a room, into a home, and know they belonged. As Angela's influence deepened in Washington, she became more than just a consultant, she became a compass. Lawmakers from both sides of the aisle began seeking her insight not only because of her vision, but because her work delivered measurable results. Her developments didn't just house people, they revived economies, reduced crime, increased school attendance, and even improved mental health statistics in underserved areas. Soon, she was appointed as senior advisor to the newly established Federal Council on Equitable Housing and Infrastructure, a body designed to guide the nation's largest urban renewal efforts. But Angela, true to form, didn't just accept the title. She rewrote what it meant to hold power. Rather than sit behind closed doors, she insisted on holding community hearings every month, open town halls where residents from all backgrounds could voice their needs directly to decision-makers. At one such forum in Detroit, a young single mother named Janelle nervously took the mic and said, "I don't have degrees. I don't know policy. But I know my rent eats half my paycheck, and my daughter's school has more mold than books." Angela walked down from the stage, stood beside Janelle, and replied, "Then you're the expert we need." That moment went viral. It became symbolic of Angela's style of leadership, inclusive, unfiltered, and driven by lived experience. She popularized the term, ground-up governance, policies designed not in ivory towers, but in church basements, barbershops, and corner stores. She also began cultivating what she called the Legacy Circle, a hand-picked group of young women and men from disadvantaged backgrounds who shadowed her at board meetings, construction sites, Capitol Hill briefings, and community centers. Among them was Malik, a formerly incarcerated youth from Philadelphia who showed a knack for design thinking, and Priya, a first-generation Indian American architecture student from rural Mississippi. Under Angela's guidance, they didn't just learn the business. They learned the soul of it. They understood that development wasn't just concrete and steel, it was narrative. It was dignity. It was healing. She taught them how to pitch projects not in terms of return on investment, but return on community. And when the Legacy Circle launched their first project, a community-led library housing hybrid in Baton Rouge, Angela stood in the background, tears in her eyes, watching as they cut the ribbon themselves. She didn't need to be the face. She just needed to know the future was in good hands. One evening, Angela returned to the same bank where it all started, Echelon First National, for a private ceremony honoring her decade of transformative impact. A bronze plaque was installed in the grand lobby. It read, "Angela Davis, Builder of Hope. Champion of Equity. Proof that power can have purpose." As the crowd dispersed and the cameras shut off, Angela walked alone down the marble hallway. She paused at the same glass conference room where, years earlier, she'd been dismissed and overlooked. She looked through the glass, now fogged slightly with age, and smiled. Because what once held her back had become a monument to everything she had overcome, and everything she had built. That night, back at her modest home, Angela sat on the porch with a cup of tea, watching the stars. She had no plans to slow down. In fact, she had just begun drafting her memoir, Blueprints from the Ground Up. But as the wind rustled the trees and laughter echoed from the house next door, she allowed herself a moment of stillness. Not pride. Not vanity. Just peace. Because Angela Davis had done something rare. She had taken the world's most immovable systems, finance, politics, real estate, and reminded them of their purpose. She had turned exclusion into empowerment. Brick by brick. Law by law. Heart by heart. And she wasn't done yet.